blistering light of June 1967, the earth did not merely tremble, it began to tear. For 6,000 years, these sands have drunk the blood of empires, but never has the geography of the human soul changed so violently in just 6 days. While the world watched the borders, the sky was preparing to fall. Imagine the morning of a man at his table. A coffee cup sits before him, the steam rising in a lazy, rhythmic swirl. A moment of profound ordinariness. Suddenly, the liquid begins to tremble. A low, guttural thrum vibrates through the floorboards, a sound felt in the marrow of the bone before it is ever heard by the ear. At exactly 7:50 a.m., the air above Egypt ceased to belong to the birds. It belonged to the sudden silver flash of Israeli wings. In the heartbeat between a breath and a scream, the pride of a nation is set ablaze. This was Operation Focus, mocked. It was the culmination of a decade of surgical planning and a desperate realization that for Israel, to wait was to perish. Facing them was an Egyptian force of 100,000 men and 950 tanks in the Sinai alone, backed by the Soviet-supplied might of nearly 450 modern combat aircraft. The odds were a numerical noose. Yet, in those first 3 hours, the Israeli Air Force didn't just fight a war, they conducted a digital deletion of an analog enemy. Pressured by the iron whispers of his generals, Gamal Abdel Nasser had cast his shadow across the Sinai weeks prior. He moved his legions into the burning waste, choked the southern throat of the sea at the Straits of Tiran to silence Israeli trade, and wove a web of steel with Syria and Jordan. It was a mobilization of pride, a grand theater of defiance, where common men became the currency of a high-stakes gamble. In the streets of Cairo, the public held its breath, suspended between the euphoria of a promised triumph and the cold, creeping dread of the unknown. Israel's military, meanwhile, had sharpened its claws into a lethal instrument of precision, fueled by the existential terror that there would be no second chances. The air above the Nile grew heavy with the scent of ozone and ancient dust. When the first Israeli mirages and vautours dipped below Egyptian radar, flying mere meters above the waves and the dunes, they bypassed the very concept of a front line. They struck 18 Egyptian airfields simultaneously. By high noon, the sky had become a graveyard. What began as the proud backbone of a revolution was, in the span of 3 rhythmic heartbeats, reduced to a jagged skeleton of aluminum and oil. 280 modern jets, the silver hawks of Egypt, never even tasted the wind. They were caught in the vulnerability of the nest, transformed into scrap metal before their engines could scream a protest. Across the horizon, the Syrian Air Force soon met the same hollow fate, wiped clean from the tarmac as if erased by a divine hand. The air, once thick with the promise of protection, was now empty, save for the pillars of black smoke that rose like funeral pyres across the desert. These were the only monuments left to a dream of dominance. With the heavens cleared of resistance, the silence was broken not by wings, but by the grinding gears of the earth. 30 minutes after the sky fell, the Israeli ground offensive rolled forward, a wall of 800 tanks advancing into a void where cover no longer existed. The sun beat down on a landscape stripped of its shield, exposing every trench and every soul to the gaze of an unopposed predator. While the pride of Egypt lay in charred heaps, the airwaves were filled with the intoxicating perfume of a phantom triumph. In Cairo and Amman, the voice of the Arabs began to weave a tapestry of glorious delusions. The announcer's voice crackled through every transistor, vibrating with the electric certainty of victory. They spoke of Israeli planes falling like autumn leaves, and of invincible columns piercing the heart of the Negev. In the cities, people wept with joy, dancing to the rhythm of a conquest that existed only in the ether. But on the front lines, this fog of falsehood was a death shroud. Egyptian soldiers, huddled in shallow trenches, listened to their own radios in a state of fractured reality. This disconnect proved fatal. Commanders, believing their own propaganda, failed to coordinate retreats or counterattacks until it was too late. Information became a blackout, a suffocating silence interrupted only by the rhythmic, desperate lies of the state. Morale surged on the oxygen of these myths, but it was a fire without fuel. King Hussein of Jordan had walked a tightrope over the abyss, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what war would cost. But the Jordanian military was no longer entirely his own. It beat to the rhythm of Egyptian General Riyadh's commands, fueled by the false reports of Egyptian successes in the south. The order was issued, not with the steady hand of a sovereign, but with the desperate momentum of a regional fire. The columns began their march toward Jabal al-Mukaber, seeking to anchor the southern heights of Jerusalem before the world dissolved. In the Israeli war room, Moshe Dayan watched the maps. He had intended to keep his gaze fixed on the burning sands of the Sinai, but Jerusalem is a gravity no man can resist. As the first machine guns began their rhythmic stutter against the ancient stones, Dayan pivoted. He summoned the 55th Paratroopers Brigade, men who had been prepared for a desert drop, and redirected them toward the jagged limestone of the Judean hills. Against the ink-black sky, the ancient city walls were suddenly illuminated by the predatory orange glow of modern tracers. In the narrow corridors of Jerusalem, the broad geometry of the desert map dissolved into the searing intimacy of the street. Here, geography was measured in inches. Jordanian commanders stood in the throat of the storm, positioned between their units, their eyes mirroring the staccato rhythm of muzzle flashes that tore through the ancient dark. The battle for the holy city stripped away the ornament of rank, leaving only the raw bone of valor. Every alleyway became a cathedral of shadow. The struggle for Jerusalem was the spiritual hinge of the war. When the Israeli paratroopers finally breached the Lion's Gate and reached the Western Wall, the geopolitical shockwaves bypassed the brain and struck the gut. For the first time in 2 millennia, the old city was under Jewish sovereignty. This was the moment the war stopped being a military engagement and became a permanent transformation of the Middle Eastern psyche. While these fires burned in the holy streets, a different kind of silence was falling over Cairo. Within the muffled walls of the presidency, President Nasser and Speaker Anwar Sadat stood at the edge of an abyss. The truth arrived as a cold, rhythmic tapping of catastrophic reports. When the realization finally took hold that the Egyptian Air Force had been obliterated, the sun seemed to go out in Nasser's world. He did not rage. Instead, the man who personified the pulse of the Arab world retreated into a private, lightless sanctuary. Sadat would later write of this hour, confessing a truth that shivered with the weight of a fallen empire. I was broken. The retreat in the Sinai that followed was not a movement of troops. It was the collapse of the human spirit. Field Marshal Amer's panicked order for a general withdrawal transformed a difficult defense into a massacre. In the burning expanse, the word order was scorched from the earth. What remained was a frantic, sightless migration. The sky had transformed into a predatory god. Every soldier's neck was permanently craned upward, watching for the streak of a jet that promised obliteration. On the desert floor, men moved through a graveyard of steel, stripping abandoned vehicles for water. One veteran remembers the weight of the steering wheel in his hands as he navigated through the carnage, describing the sickening jolt of the tires, the sound of driving over the bodies of his own brothers in arms. In that furnace of panic, the moral compass melted. The highway became a mirror of judgment, where the bond of the uniform dissolved into the dust. In the West Bank, the order of the world fractured similarly. What began as a structured fallback for Jordan became a frantic exodus. The streets of the ancient hills became a theater of the surreal. Women were seen running into the open air without their headscarves, a stripping away of all earthly dignity. Parents reached for hands that weren't there, and neighbors became shadows passing in the smoke. To those fleeing through the rubble of homes that had sheltered lineages for 700 years, it was not merely a military defeat. It was the shattering of a foundation so deep that the soul forgot how to hope. While the southern and central horizons were still choked with ash, a deceptive stillness hung over the north. For 5 days, the Syrian front had been a gallery of ghosts. The Golan Heights loomed over the Galilee like a vertical wall of basalt. To the Syrian defenders entrenched in the rock, they were untouchable, gods behind concrete and wire. They believed the geography of the world was their shield. They were mistaken. On June 9th, the Israeli military performed an act of violent transcendence. At the foot of the heights, the order was given to climb. It was a gambit that defied the laws of gravity. Steel treads bit into volcanic soil. Tanks, tilted at impossible angles, crawled up the face of the cliffs. The defense was ferocious. A rain of fire from 250 Syrian tanks and hundreds of artillery pieces. Yet, the ascent continued. One by one, the bunkers were silenced by the intimacy of the blade and grenade. By the time the sun began to sink on the 6th day, the impossible heights had been conquered. The Israeli vanguard pushed forward until the minarets of Damascus were visible through the heat haze, less than 70 kilometers away. As darkness fell over the newly unified Jerusalem, the air vibrated with a mechanical growl. The Maghrebi Quarter had stood for 700 years, a tapestry of Moroccan heritage. But in the span of a single night, it was reduced to dust. There was no formal decree. The bulldozers began their work while the tea was still warm on the tables. One witness remembers the horror. The machines were not stopping. Families fled into the night in their pajamas. By morning, where a neighborhood had pulsed with life, there was only a vast, leveled void. A tabula rasa of gravel and broken spirit. History was being revised by the weight of the plow. The truth of this total collapse eventually returned to Cairo as a thunderclap. Gamal Abdel Nasser stood before a small glass lens, his face a landscape of exhaustion. He spoke of the setback, announcing his resignation and offering his own soul as a sacrifice for the collective shame. But then, a strange alchemy occurred. Instead of silence, a roar rose from the belly of the city. Hundreds of thousands flooded the streets, not screaming for a new savior, but for the man who had failed them. They demanded he stay to be the father of their grief. Why would a people demand the return of a man who had lost their world? Perhaps because without him, they were not just defeated, they were alone. This bond of shared trauma ensured that even in total military failure, the old structures would remain, calcified by the very catastrophe they created. The sun that set over the Middle East on the 10th of June was not the same sun that had risen 6 days prior. It shone upon a geography transformed by a rupture in the soul. These 6 days solidified into a permanent architecture of the mind, a fortress of memory. The psychological landscape was altered more irrevocably than the sands of the Sinai. The grand vision of a unified Arab destiny, a dream that once soared on the wings of modern jets, lay shattered. What remained was a profound, aching hollow. Looking back, the debris of 1967 is not composed of steel alone. The desert is a graveyard for the corpses of ideas, the silent, tattered remains of a hope that once promised a different world. We are the inheritors of that silence, living in the long, cold shadow of a week that never ended. We walk among the ruins, wondering if we are simply the ghosts haunting the wreckage of a dream that died before it could ever truly be born.